Okay, well, good evening. Good weird evening. So it's been quite a day for everybody. Welcome to the Pocatello League Forum, a 2021 Legislature preview. Terry Kaufman, League this evening. This will be recorded and available later on YouTube with a lot of luck. So recordings of this event, whether they be in person or of a computer screen, may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio, video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by the media who is reporting on the event. So I will now turn the time over to our moderator, Terry.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Jamar. The format tonight will be as follows. I will introduce the panelists, and they will each have a few minutes to briefly share their personal perspectives on the upcoming legislative session, or they will have a chance to comment about what has happened at our Capitol today. Then during the remainder of the forum, they will answer questions that were compiled and sent to them last week by the League of Women Voters. Because it is not practical to take questions from so many viewers online, we won't be taking questions tonight from the audience this evening, and viewers will be muted. However, we do encourage you to send your specific questions to our legislators. So if you turn on your chat box, you will find each of the legislative emails in the chat box. Also, to view the speaker only, you can click on the speaker view option in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Also, a hashtag marker will appear between each speaker's responses. So I will begin by introducing our panelists. First, we have Representative Kevin Andrus, who is a Republican from District 28, House Seat B. He will be entering his second term. He is the Vice Chair of Agricultural Affairs and also serves on the Business and State Affairs committees. Next, we have Representative Dustin Manwaring, Republican, District 29, Seat A, and he returns to the Idaho Legislature after one term in the House from 2016 to 2018. He is the Vice Chair for Agricultural Affairs and also serves on the Business and State Affairs Committee. And then we have Mr. Oh, excuse me, I think I read that wrong. Mr. Manwaring will be joining the Resources and Conservation Committee, Revenue and Taxation, and Transportation and Defense Committees. And next we have Representative James Ruchti. He is a Democrat from District 29, House Seat B, previously served in the House from 2006 to 2010. During his new term, Mr. Ruchti will be serving on the following committees: Revenue and Taxation, Judiciary, Rules and Administration, and Agriculture. So now, starting with Mr. Andrus, who I think is here, his technology is okay. We can start with Mr. Andrus, and you will each have up to 4 minutes to share your views on the issues and bills that you expect to be introduced during the upcoming legislative session. Also, what are your goals for this session? But again, however, if you'd rather discuss what went on today at the Capitol, you are free to do that as well. So we'll start with Mr. Andrus, if you're ready. And if Mr. Andrus is not ready, then we can go right to Mr. Manwaring.
All right. Well, let me just start by saying thank you to the League for having us tonight. I appreciated the forums that I participated in a couple of years ago, and I think it's awesome to see so many members of the community jump on to a call like this that we have online. I see some familiar faces, including Representative Smith, so thanks for joining us. I do want to just start out by saying how astonished and disappointed I was today, to frankly disgusted to see what I saw in our nation's capital. I want to make clear I don't condone those type of actions, and they don't represent my values. I don't think they represent the Republican Party values that I know and the people that I know and represent here in Pocatello. So I just want to say that and make that clear from the beginning. Just briefly, I'm born and raised in southeastern Idaho. I've had a law practice in Pocatello for 10 years now, primarily do business and estate planning. My expectation for this session, and I'm excited to get back to Boise, I think we're going to be immediately dealing with some balance of power issues. And I can speak to those a little bit more in detail soon, but that includes the governor's disaster declaration authority, the powers of the Department of Health and Welfare, and spending what are called non-cognizable, or those federal dollars that haven't been appropriated in the last legislative session. So those are the things that I think are going to be pressing issues that I know we're going to be dealing with. And then that also, in addition to that, will be a proposed constitutional amendment that allows the legislature to call itself back into session when we have issues like we've had in a year like this. I'm most interested, though, to work on some ways that hopefully we can reduce property taxes, and also to address some ongoing funding for some transportation needs. I also personally look forward to working on some legislation with regards to digital asset protection and some other local constituent needs that have been brought to my attention. So I think I'll stop there, and thanks again.
Mr. Ruchti?
There we go. You'd think I'd know how to do this since we all do so many Zoom meetings. I want to thank the league as well. This is really just something I missed during this election cycle, not being able to do these sorts of forums. And it's fun to see Elaine and Donna. I was in the legislature with them from 2006 to 10. And so it's kind of fun to go back with a different group. When I was in the legislature before, it was with Kevin Andrus's dad as well. So this is going to be a lot of fun to go back and see some of the people that I knew previously, but there's lots of new faces, and I'm looking forward to working with Dustin. You know, originally I was going to talk about, during this sector of this event, I was going to talk about property taxes and restoring education money that had been withheld from the budget, finding ways to recruit quality teachers, and of course the challenges of conducting a legislative session during the age of COVID. But instead, I thought I would just spend a couple of minutes here making sure we're all on the same page as to what happened today. And by that, I mean that we understand how significant today's events were. This was a watershed moment at the end of a watershed year. And nobody should view it as anything less than that. I really worry that our constitutional republic is in trouble, that our government is in trouble, and our way of life could be in trouble unless we fix the problem and do it now. And I'm not suggesting that I have the answers as to how to do it, but I've lived on this earth long enough to know that this is not the way a free society behaves. It's not the way a democratic society is supposed to work. And like you, I can see what the problems are. Those are easy enough to identify. Figuring out how to fix them, obviously, is the challenge. But unless we're all on the same page as to the need to fix them, I don't think it gets done. The one thing that can be said about what happened today that may be a little light is that it forced everybody, I believe, to get on the same page in how we view what's been happening. And we cannot let it continue. We saw what mob rule looks like, and it was sobering. And it doesn't respect the rule of law. It doesn't acknowledge the voice of the people, and it doesn't want to hear opposing viewpoints. It wields rudeness and obnoxious behavior as a weapon, and weapons as a way of getting you to listen to their obnoxious opinions. I tell you this simply because I fear that we're doing permanent damage to our democracy. spirited debate, peaceful demonstrations, criticism of government officials. That's as old as the country is, and it's as American as apple pie and baseball, but they're part of our foundation, just like the rule of law is, and respect for opinions of others and kindness. And we're starting to lose those important bases of our democracy. And so those are the things that I think we need to be on the same page about. We can't allow what we saw today and what we saw, frankly, during the special session at the Idaho Capitol continue. We have to stop justifying such behavior. We have to stop using whataboutisms. We have to recognize that there truly are bright lines between what is in bounds and what is out of bounds. Thank you.
Mr. Andrus. Are we not connected with Mr. Andrus?
He has to unmute himself. I can only ask to unmute. I'm hoping that Jamar will unmute him for us. If he's not able to, he's on the phone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yes. There
Yay.
you are. Okay,
Awesome.
I did fail to mention that you were actually replacing Mr. Randy Armstrong. So, and who will be at our next forum. So yes, welcome, Kevin, and go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry, I can't see any of your faces and you can't see mine, but here in the outskirts of Lava, we don't have the best internet. But I haven't even seen much of the news yet. I've heard some stuff, so I don't know fully what has gone on today, but from what I've heard, it's very, very disappointing, and I would echo what Representative Manwaring said, that those are not the beliefs that I share, that I do not condone those actions, and I don't know why or who did it, but that's not how I believe we should act. But then to the session that's forthcoming, I think a big thing that we will be working on is the balance of powers and the three branches of government, and making sure that we in code have a balance between the three branches of government at the state level to ensure that that our proper roles are carried forth and done accordingly. I think that's a big one. Another thing is people will be looking to do some tax relief, as there's a surplus in the budget. Also, I'm working on a few things like helping out the horse racing industry to get better funding, and then also working on some nonprofit legislation to protect them. So that's what I have. I'm sure there will be a lot more, but we'll know shortly what more is on the docket. Thank you.
All right, so now we'll go to the questions. We'll be rotating through the questions, and with our legislators, you'll have 2 minutes to answer each question. So the first question, we'll start with Mr. Manwaring, followed by Mr. Ruchti, and then Mr. Andrus. And this question is about Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion has helped thousands of Idahoans gain medical coverage. It has supported rural hospitals and healthcare providers giving services to underserved populations. How would you justify cutting Medicaid expansion?
Well, I don't know, first of all, if I'm going to jump to cutting Medicaid expansion, but I think that the underlying issue here is that we have a mandate to fund it from the voters. And if we can't find an ongoing dedicated funding source, we have a problem. And then that's what results in limitation of services. So we need to figure out how to have an ongoing funding source for that. I think we do have in this session some privilege to put some of that surplus towards that. But again, that's just a Band-Aid on the issue. We're going to have to pull out and dedicate some specific source to that. One thing that when I'm looking at the numbers for Medicaid expansion, it's coming in a lot, the cost is coming in a lot higher than expected, or at least some of those people a couple of years ago anticipated it would be much higher, and that's turning out to be true. It's $67 million this year, $84 million next year. I remember listening to the first projections, and I think at the high end it was around 45 million, and we're far exceeding that cost. At the same time, we also have ongoing funding requests for the state catastrophic fund. We thought, and we were told a couple of years ago, that it would eliminate the need for the catastrophic fund. And this year's budget request for the CAT fund is still $8.5 million. So there's still a need. There still is a group of people that's falling without health insurance and not covered, that's coming back to the counties to have to pay for. So we know that we're going to have to continue to provide some sort of relief to help the counties pay for those individuals. But I think we might have to look for ways in the future to allow, make sure the counties are doing their part as well to help fund.
Thank you.
Piece of it. Thanks.
Mr. Ruchti?
Yeah, so I believe there's 37 states now that have taken advantage of Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. There's a couple more states who will do it in 2021. And when you look at this question and how we're going to address any budget constraints or budget funding needs, I think you have to start with how did we get here? And the way we got here is we had about 67,000 people in Idaho who fell in that gap, and they didn't qualify under Obamacare for tax credits, and they couldn't get insurance, or they couldn't get Medicaid under the traditional path, and so they didn't have insurance. And you had over 60% of the people vote in favor of asking the legislature to expand Medicaid. So there's a need for it. And I get that right now it's kind of hard to tell how much the funding shortfall is, what exactly we need to do, what money we need to come up with. I think part of that is because we're, some of it could be the effect of being in the age of COVID, people just getting used to having healthcare and living with healthcare. And so I think to some extent we got to take some time and make sure we know what the true numbers are. But there are ways to do it. I mean, we have a surplus, which, that's going to be, like Dustin said, just a Band-Aid, because that's one-time money. Once it's gone, it's gone. But we also have the internet sales tax money. There's other ways to hopefully maintain funding.
And Mr. Andrus?
Yeah, I think that Medicaid expansion has done a great job in covering up the gap when so many people didn't have medical coverage, and how devastating that is. The question is, going forward, is where do we take the money from to support and pay for Medicaid expansion going forward? I mean, the budget is limited, and it'll just be a matter of if we can pull it from something else. And potentially, instead of giving tax cuts, it could happen. But generally, people are more in favor of tax cuts, but we'll have to see how that works. Thank you.
All right. And also, as a reminder for the panelists, your timing is in the chat box to just let you know where you are in terms of the timing. Okay. Next question. We'll start with Mr. Rupte and then go to Mr. Manwaring and then Mr. Andrus. Climate. The United States League of Women Voters has adopted a position on climate change that includes the following statements. The League is calling for prompt action to cut this country's greenhouse gas emissions and invest in a clean energy economy. State and local leagues and individual league members have a critical role to play in helping to limit future climate change and protect the planet. How will you address the adverse effects of climate change on Idaho's businesses and economy?
So I'm a big believer in this issue, and I do hope to play a role in the legislative sessions, the upcoming sessions on this issue. I'm hoping, frankly, I'm hopeful that with a new administration and a strong federal climate policy, which I'm anticipating there will be with the Biden administration, that we can make significant progress in this arena and hopefully take a lead on the world stage again when it comes to combating climate change. You know, I don't think I'm telling anybody anything new or surprising, but one of our biggest issues really with climate change in Idaho and in many states is it's kind of a cultural issue. We have got to get to the point where we're relying on data, facts, and science, and we can't just reject science because it inconveniences our worldviews. We have to accept what is happening with climate change. I'm going to be serving on the Ag Committee. One of the things that I'm hoping to learn about on the Ag Committee is how our agricultural practices, both growing, harvesting, planning, are adjusting to meet today's realities when it comes to climate change. I'd like to take a look at preparing or see how other states have prepared climate action plans and see if we could do something similar in Idaho.
Mr. Manwaring?
So I believe in a market-based limited government approach to address conservation and climate change. But I also recognize that there's an ideological gap in the environmental movement, or at least there has been. And I think that's certainly seen in Congress, but it's also at the state level. For one, I think we can do more in the conservative movement to address conservation issues and environmental issues and make it part of our platform. I think it is something that conservatives can do a lot better with. We are an ag-based state. Obviously in Idaho, we rely on our forests, our rivers, our farmland. It's the lifeblood of our economy. And so some of the best conservationists I know are farmers and ranchers. It means a lot to them. But we also have the Idaho National Lab here, and one of the cleanest forms and doesn't produce greenhouse gases is nuclear energy. So I think that's one thing we can be proud of here in Idaho and champion. It's a unique combination of something that's clean and scalable, and we should promote that in every way we can. We should continue to focus our efforts on recharging the Upper Snake Plain aquifer. And we need to get salmon. We need to get those fish back, those fish populations back up. And I'll support efforts to do that, get our fish population back up in Idaho. Thanks.
Mr. Andrus?
Thank you. As a member in the Ag Committee, and then also as a rancher myself, we really recognize the impact that wildfires are having to our state as an industry, but also especially to the environment and to our air quality. So one of the ways that I think that we can combat this the best is through grazing, reduce the burnable material, and then also logging that is done in a very conservative way that will not clear cut logging, but done in a way that we can still have our forests, but mitigate the fuel that is there. And then another thing is we have so many options for renewable energy in this great state. We've got a lot of wind, unfortunately, and at some times, and then solar, and then nuclear energy is great too. So look into those avenues as well, and I think we've got a lot of good opportunity.
Okay, next question. We'll start with Mr. Andrus and then go to Mr. Manwaring and Mr. Rupte. Funding for education. Public school and higher education funding have been inadequate for many years. Higher ed experienced significant cuts during the COVID crisis. School districts rely on passing supplemental levies based on property taxes. Our current funding is highly inequitable. How do you plan to support education funding this year?
Thank you. Yes, if we don't have education funding, what will our society be, right? I recognize the importance of funding our education and managing that to train our future, to train our leaders. And I don't know the best solution to get better funding. Those that are on the JFAC committee come up with those formulas and those amounts. And I'm all for giving as much funding as we can to our education system, because I know that without that, then we don't have our great state. Thank you.
Mr. Manwaring?
I think we should start with a premise, and sometimes you hear this, but I think it's important that education's the lion's share of our general fund budget, over 62%. So you can't just create more dollars if there's not more revenue. So that's about $2.52 billion that we spent on education, and it was increased almost 4% last year. This year we have to address the setback or the holdback and put those dollars back, hopefully, into education. But over the last 6+ years, $100 million has gone into the career ladder. So I think the legislature has taken good steps forward to fund education. And it's becoming, for me, more not just a funding issue, but what can we do better with those dollars to make sure that we are producing results. One thing that the legislature had been working on and tried to, but failed so far, is to change the funding formula for schools. I think that's one thing that we can continue to try to work on, change from an attendance-based formula to an enrollment-based formula, maybe a step forward. There is a temporary proposed rule by the State Department of the Board of Education to do that. That will allow the legislature this session to review that temporary rule and to try to come up with some better ways to fund schools. We just have to do a better job, including at the local level and with what we're producing in our colleges and universities and the outcomes. And it's not always just more dollars.
Mr. Ruchti?
I think you'll find that Dustin and I agree on quite a few things as we spend time in the legislature. And I do recognize what he's saying. I'm not sure I'm in total agreement, because I think sometimes it is dollars. And I don't think Idaho has prioritized education like it needs to. When I was in the legislature back 2006 and we had deep education cuts, and it took us several years to get back to the point we were when the cuts were made. And so we've always been, since that time, been playing catch up. Now, the legislature has made some efforts, as as Representative Manwaring mentioned, and those should be recognized and applauded. But we've got to do better. We're losing quality teachers, and if you don't have quality teachers in the classroom, the education that our students are getting is wanting. And so we've got to pay attention to that. The funding formula, I totally agree with Representative Manwaring on that. When the funding formula was created, we didn't have charter schools. We didn't have, I'm not even sure we had the internet. We didn't have online learning, certainly. And so we have this funding formula that's based on an education system that none of us really recognize today. We've got to fix that. And it's that fundamental need that we have is proved to be a bridge too far for the legislature, which is unfortunate. So there are things we can do, and a lot of it does mean we got to find ways to fund education.
Okay. Next question. Mr. Manwaring, you can start, followed by Mr. Rupte and then Mr. Andrus. This question's on property taxes. According to the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, families who earn less pay a greater percentage of their income to property taxes. Throughout Idaho, property taxes are increasing at an unsustainable rate. In addition to hurting families, this is discouraging companies from moving to Idaho. What legislative options are available to ensure property taxes are more sustainable and equitable across all income levels?
Well, the easy one to say and the hardest one to do is probably just to tighten government spending, right? And the state can come in with a heavy hand and say, local governments, you need to stop spending so much. But that doesn't always work if the state also, on the other hand, mandates things that they have to pay for. So if you look at the proposals that came out of the interim committee this year that studied property taxes, they all pretty much include tightening government spending. The first one is a cap on local government spending or budget and taxing increases, including due to new construction, and it caps it at 4%, unless there's a 2/3 voter a sign off to increase that beyond that amount. And then it also ties it to a rather, well, I think it's a complex way to do it, but it ties growth to the consumer price index. The second proposal restricts local governments from building up reserve funds. And then the last proposal that I heard come out of that committee involved a new transparency program to be developed by the state controller's office so that you could see more of the local budget numbers and how spending is done. I don't think the last one's going to directly go to reducing property taxes in the immediate future. It could help us identify and fix some things in the future. But personally, I also think we need, in addition to those proposals, we need to look at potentially increasing how much an assessment can increase in a given year. One example that I have that I'm working on to see where it goes, if there's to avoid those shock assessments, would be to limit how much an assessment can increase. I'll stop there. Thanks.
As Representative Manwaring mentioned, there was an interim committee to study the property tax issue, because property taxes in our area, but especially over in the Treasure Valley, are just skyrocketing. If you know anybody in the Treasure Valley who has sold their home recently or had to buy one, they can attest to that. The property values are skyrocketing, and so are property taxes. The problem I had with the interim committee and the proposals that were made, it was mentioned that the proposals were mentioned, none of them really directly cut property taxes. And so the proposals, to me, weren't really proposals that were all that helpful. And it wasn't that there weren't proposals given to the interim committee. There was a proposal on lifting the freeze on the homeowner's exemption. Right now it's capped at 100,000. There was a proposal on increasing the circuit breaker tax, or circuit breaker to increase the amount to help needy seniors. And there were some other proposals, but none of them were allowed to be considered by the committee. And so there are answers out there, and some of those answers hopefully will be considered by the Revenue and Taxation Committee, which Representative Manwaring and I will be serving on together.
Mr. Andrus?
Yeah, property tax is one of the most unjust tax, because when you get something, it can increase exponentially, and Idaho has a real problem with this. And I think it comes down to cutting our funding, cutting our spending. We need to work on spending less at the state level and the local level, and see if we can get the rates down, and see if we can get a handle on this so that we don't tax people out of their homes.
Next question is on redistricting. We'll start with Mr. Rupte, followed by Mr. Andrus, and then Mr. Manwaring. The Idaho League of Women Voters was fundamental in the adoption of a nonpartisan Idaho Redistricting Commission and is now working on the Fair Power Project to educate Idahoans about the process. What changes, if any, do you recommend relative to the makeup of the current commission or redistricting process?
I'm glad you had this question on here because as everyone probably knows, there'll be a redistricting process this year after the census is complete. I don't recommend any changes to the current makeup of that committee. That process we use is a bipartisan process, 3 Republican appointed members, 3 Democrat appointed members, and it works. In fact, it receives a lot of praise throughout the United States because there are a lot of states whose redistricting commissions or processes don't work that well. And what ends up happening is because you have a bipartisan committee with an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, they eventually end up working together. And I know there are exceptions to that. I know that occasionally these cases go to the Idaho Supreme Court to decide, but the system we use works and works well, and it'll work well this time.
Mr. Andrus?
Yes. Yeah, the bipartisanship of the redistricting committee is a great system. The concern I have is how often the matter has to go to the courts to be handled, but I don't know of any way that you can make that any better, so I don't see any reason to change.
Mr. Manwaring?
Yeah, I remember this came up a couple of years ago, tried to make a change to the redistricting commission and add a 7th tie-break member, which I think was going to be a state constitutional officer. That proposal failed. It didn't really go anywhere, but it was discussed pretty seriously for a while in the Capitol. I think we're doing a good job. I think this will be another example to hopefully get through it, and we won't have to go to the courts. I'm not going to be pushing any changes to that commission. And if there were further controls that help prevent gerrymandering, but I don't think that I would support, but I don't think Idaho has that problem. So I think we all agree on this question.
All right, next question is on social issues. We'll start with Mr. Andrus, followed by Mr. Manwaring, and then Mr. Rupte. There are a number of social issues that our communities are facing. These include, but are not limited to, mental health, suicide, housing assistance, child abuse, and foster children aging out of the system. What are your priorities in funding for important social services?
Yeah, I think that all of these issues are important, and in some ways they're becoming more of issues, and we need to make sure that we have all of the adequate funding to take care of them. And I don't know in each of those categories how much funding goes to them, and how well it is taken care of off the top of my head, but I certainly want to ensure that we have enough funding to take care of our people, because our health is of the utmost importance, and I would support all the funding that we can muster to take care of that. Thank you.
Mr. Manwaring?
I think the behavioral crisis centers are a good example, and I'm hearing good things about the one we set up in Pocatello. I think the important thing is the outcomes that we're focusing on, making sure that whatever we do, we can invest in dollars that are helping people face those challenges with knowledge, with confidence and hope. That's what will change outcomes. I think that if we increase, it's sort of like education. The more dollars you increase early on, you're saving money later. I think the same thing is true for mental health. I also think we can look at any dollars that we can save and that are going towards our state prisons should go directly back into mental health and crisis prevention. That's another example for me of if you can get people services early on, we keep them out of the prisons later, and that's a savings to the state. So I'll be looking at that. I've looked at those numbers of the prison populations, and that continues to outpace our spending on prisons continues to outpace a lot of other state agencies, most all of them, frankly, in the rate of growth. So it's a big one.
Mr. Ruchti?
I wish there was a magic wand, some sort of panacea for these issues, but I think a lot of them boil down to lack of healthcare, good paying jobs. We haven't increased our minimum wage in many years. People are trying to live and raise families on very little money and without access to healthcare. And I think that creates enormous pressures on people, both individually and in their family lives. And that's where a lot of the social issues that we then deal with and pay for in other ways through court systems, through the Department of Health and Welfare. We're still paying for these things because as a society, we don't make the sacrifice of, increasing the minimum wage and ensuring everybody has access to healthcare. So, I know those are big picture ideas, but really, if you want solutions, you got to make sure people have good paying jobs, make enough money to provide for their families and have health care and a good education.
All right, next question. We'll start with Mr. Manwaring and then go to Mr. Rupte and then Mr. Andrus. Governor's emergency powers. Recently, some have voiced concerns about Governor Little's emergency powers in response to the COVID crisis and calling special legislative sessions. How do you plan to ensure the balance of power among government branches fulfills the requirements of the Idaho Constitution?
I mentioned some of this in my opening, but to get into a little bit more detail, our Constitution does require a balance of powers. The legislature doesn't have right now the ability to call itself back into session. I think that's one way immediately that the legislature could move to shift that back into balance, so that it could review actions of the executive branch and choose to take action to legislate differently if it needed to, if there was an extended period of an emergency. So I mentioned that there will be a proposed constitutional amendment for that. I expect that to come this session. Some other ones that I'm aware of, I expect that there will be a limitation, or excuse me, there will be some sort of clarifying language that the governor's executive orders and proclamations must be essential to protect life or property from the occurrence of an imminent threat, that it must not restrict the right of Idahoans to work, to provide for their families, or otherwise contribute to the economy in Idaho. I know that one's on the table. I also believe there'll be a limitation proposed to limit the governor's declaration authority to no more than 30 days. He can't roll that extension without approval of the legislature. I hope that we can guarantee religious liberty, the right to assemble during emergencies, as well as all other rights in the Constitution and civil liberties. and that the governor won't be able to suspend Idaho code during his disaster emergency. The quarantines will be limited to individual persons diagnosed with infectious and communicable diseases. And again, I think I also mentioned briefly the non-cognizable funds, which is the federal funds that haven't been appropriated.
Thank you.
Will need the legislative authority.
Mr. Ruchti?
Yeah, this one is an interesting one. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. There are people who just have nothing good to say about how the governor has used his emergency powers, and they think that he's hasn't used enough of them or used them enough. And then you have a group that feel like he's overused them. And legislators are concerned because he's taken actions and haven't involved legislators in those decisions. And so I'm going to go into this with an open mind, because I know other states handle these issues differently. And there are a lot of good solutions out there and a lot of things that don't work. So I'll be just listening, absorbing, and trying to figure out what should work, what would work best in Idaho. But I'm going to be highly skeptical of any plan that places the responsibility for managing an emergency in the lap of the legislature. They are not built for that. You watched it. They are good at creating interim committees to study stuff. And if you need something done quickly and decisively, that's not something the legislature is built to do. My own opinion, I feel like Governor Little has generally done an admirable job in managing this crisis. It would be tough for anybody to manage given how divergent the views are, but he's, I feel like he's done a good job. One of the things I will pay attention to, and I'd ask you to consider, is these issues come up, we have to recognize that we will not always have a Brad Little or a Butch Otter or a Dirk Kempthorne or a Cecil Andrus in the governor's seat. It might be a Janice McGeehan or a Heather Scott. And so when we're talking about what sort of powers to give the chief executive of this state, we need to keep that in mind, because we may regret not having curtailed those powers someday.
Mr. Andrus?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of differing opinions of how the governor has dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, and no matter how you feel about it, I think one thing to me is clear is that the legislature through the years has given more of their rights and power to the executive branch, and that needs, that under this stress we've seen that was inappropriate, and some of that needs to come back to where it rightfully belongs under the Constitution. So there will be a few things to do, and rightfully so, that the legislature is not the body to handle an emergency on a short time frame, but this pandemic has been going on for months, and the legislature should have been able to do some of their duties in that time. Thank you.
Next question. We'll start with Mr. Ruchti, then go to Mr. Andrus, and then Mr. Manwaring. Science standards. Common Core standards, especially the science standards, have been under attack in past legislative sessions. How do you feel about the science standards as written that include statements recognizing human-caused climate change?
I'm a big advocate and fan of the Common Core standards, and the science standards, although I think in shorthand we always refer to those as Common Core standards, they actually aren't part of the Common Core standards. They're part of the next generation. They come from the next generation science standards. Totally different group of people who came up with them, but they went through the same sort of process where they obtained public feedback or feedback from the science community before being adopted and issued. So our science standards are excellent. Common Core standards for math and English language arts are excellent. They are not without problems, but the problems aren't with the standards themselves. It's with the understanding of those standards. And part of that had to do with the rollout. I don't think they were rolled out well enough with educators. In other words, I'm not sure at least some educators were prepared to teach from those standards. And that created confusion with both students and parents. And then of course we know, I don't think it helps to have social media in the age of Common Core standards, because you can create a meme to make fun of anything. But the standards themselves are good, and we need to rely on data, facts, and science as we educate our children. They need to understand how to rely on data, facts, and science.
Mr. Andrus?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I believe in the science standards to some degree, although I do not necessarily agree that climate change is due to all human, that it is necessarily human caused. And I don't know exactly what is always causing it, but I do not necessarily agree that it is human caused. Thank you.
All right. And Mr. Manwaring?
So I don't claim to be any expert on Common Core or, as Representative Ruchti said, the next generation science standards. I guess I'll just say I do believe that we humans do contribute something to the changes in our biosphere. I'm not oblivious to that. I do believe that's true. But if you go back to this issue in particular, I think directly to the question, in 2017, Representative Syme from Caldwell, I think, is kind of what pushed this and caused a stir in the education community in Idaho, arguing that the standards didn't teach both sides of the debate. He basically requested that you include, temperatures go up, but they also go down, and teach both sides of that debate in global temperatures. And I suppose that's a reasonable thing to request. At the time that was pulled out, and I think they did sort of a similar pull out of those standards the next year. But I think we can proceed to adopt. I like data, facts, and science as well, as Representative Ruchti pointed out. I think if we're focusing on those things and teaching all sides of the debate, we should do that. We also know that local officials can develop their own curriculums and address this issue head on too. So,
Okay. So we'll take this last question. I think we should be able to fit it in. And this one's on climate and energy efficient buildings. We know energy efficient buildings are cheaper to operate and are a financially sound investment for residences, businesses, and government. How will you ensure that the legislature takes action to support energy efficient building codes? We'll start with Mr. Andrus, then go to Mr. Manwaring and Mr. Rupte.
Yes, I'm on the business committee, and as I recall correctly, we updated the building code standards to get to the federal standards to make more energy efficient homes a requirement to some degree. And I don't know how extensive that was, and if it should have been more extensive or not. But I know that we're working on that. And then also, though, at the same time, I do believe in people's own freedom of property, and I don't think that we should mandate to a great degree how people manage their own property. Thank you.
Manwaring?
yeah, I think that sentiment rings strong in at least the House Business Committee on people's rights to manage their own property. But I also know that it's important for us to adopt codes that are consistent and fair, and that promote cost efficiencies, including through energy savings in our state. And I believe the last legislature adopted the 2018 International Conservation Code, and that will help curb some of that energy efficiency. And I know we can get some efficiencies through technologies as well to reduce the cost of operations. So that's something that I'll be watching. I'll be asking questions about how the Energy Conservation Code those provisions are working, and what else I can do to support efficiency and cost savings in new construction.
Mr. Ruchti?
Yeah, so Representative Manwaring and I attended a Zoom meeting not too long ago, and it was on the building code issues. And I came into the meeting, and actually maybe Kevin or Representative Andrus was there too, but I came into the meeting thinking it was going to be a total snooze fest. Like, I can't believe we're going to have an entire hour meeting on building codes, and it's just going to be really boring. It was the most exciting meeting I'd been to in a long time because so many people had just intense feelings about building code issues. And so it was a lot of fun. And I anticipate any debates we have about it during the session are going to be the same way. You know, some of it, I think people kind of get out over their skis on these issues. One complaint had to do with the fact that in this one subdivision outside of Idaho Falls, this legislator said, well, you know, everybody had to have a sprinkler system in their homes, and that's just ridiculous. Why do they have to have sprinklers? You know, so you kind of get the gist of it. Well, there was a county official from Bonneville County who spoke up and said, I know what neighborhood you're talking about, what development you're talking about. And he said the reason you have to have sprinklers in the home is because it was either the homeowners, Dustin, or it was the developer didn't want to have fire hydrants. And so the county said, well, that's fine, that's your choice. Then you got to do sprinkler systems. So anyway, sometimes I think people get upset without truly understanding why they're upset. But it is a sensitive issue, lots of opinions, and we'll just have to work through them. I think they're valuable to have the building codes updated. They can save energy, they can save homeowners money, but I get it can also be expensive.
All right, well, that's all of our questions for this evening. Many thanks to our legislators and our audience for attending. This forum was recorded and will be available for viewing in the next few days on the League of Women Voters Pocatello website and on YouTube. Pam will be putting up that link, I believe, momentarily. Mr. Andrus, Mr. Manwaring, and Mr. Rupte, would you enter your contact email and website links one more time so that our participants can write to you with any specific questions they might have? Thank you. Pam is also putting up the link to contact all the legislators. For all our participants this evening, we want to remind you that your voice matters. Please do contact your legislators with your comments and your questions. And just a quick reminder before we close, our next legislative forum will be on January 19th at 7 p.m. And we will hear from Senator Jim Guthrie, Senator Mark Nye, and Representative Randy Armstrong. And you can find that link to that Zoom event on our Pocatello League of Women Voters website. And we hope we'll see you there as well. Take care, and thank you again for everyone for participating. Have a good evening.